So in this episode, I'm actually going to pretty much tie together the last 3 episodes into one, explaining exactly how I went about painting my Caravan. So I'm going to begin by talking about how I prepared the surface, what paint I ended up choosing, and what my thoughts are now that the job is completely done. Now this episode is going to be for anyone who is planning to paint a Caravan themselves or is simply interested in how I went about painting my Caravan. Maybe you guys know somebody out there who has a van and has been talking about painting it. If so, I recommend sharing this episode with them. This episode is going to have a lot of detail in it. So the past 3 episodes, I've briefly touched on and shared each stage of me preparing the surface of my Caravan, trying to figure out how to actually go about painting it and then painting it. But this episode, I'm going to tie all of that together. Also, I guess, share the mistakes that I made and how I do things differently if I did it again, plus how I would recommend to do it. And so this episode, instead of watching all the other ones, you can go and do that if you want to see footage that you won't see in this one. But this one is the one you'll share with anyone if they're planning to paint a Caravan. Now, if you're planning to paint a Caravan, I recommend getting your phone out with the notes section because there's going to be a lot of information you might want to jot down, or getting a pen and paper as well. Boil the jug, grab a cold beer, whatever it is that you might like, and yeah, get ready because this episode's probably going to be a little bit longer than the previous ones. Now, keep in mind, if you're choosing to paint your Caravan yourself and you've never used a spray gun or done a project like this before, it's probably not going to turn out absolutely perfect. If you pay a professional who specializes in this kind of work, you're definitely going to get an amazing outcome. You can still get a good outcome if you do it yourself. Like, I'm really happy with the outcome that I've achieved. However, there are imperfections that kind of annoy me a little bit, which I know are because I simply hadn't done something like this before. So that's why I'm making this video, so that I can actually share my mistakes with you guys and also share extra advice that I haven't found anyone else talking about who's made videos about painting a Caravan or RV, whatever it might be. There's so much to it that I haven't seen shared in other videos. So I guess that's part of DIY projects, doing it yourself. It's not going to be perfect, but that is the best way to learn. So of course, me making mistakes on my Caravan, if I do another one or, creating this video and sharing advice with other people, there's a lot of stuff that I can share with you guys and that I would do differently next time round. Another thing to keep in mind, whether you're doing it yourself or paying a professional, if you're renovating a really old van, so for example mine I think is just over 40 years old, it is going to have some battle scars. I've got one side of the van here, which is the side that the door's on, that seems to have more dents than the other side, and that's probably because this is the side that has been lived on more. So people have had awnings, chairs, who knows what, up against the Caravan here, and over the years things have bumped into it and left dents. Now also, because it is so old, it does have a little bit of hail damage, I think, and there's a few other extra dents up above from people probably manoeuvring in and around trees. So if you do have an older van, I think painting it white, like a bright colour, helps actually hide a lot of those imperfections. But of course not everyone wants a white van, but that is something to keep in mind. Mine actually has quite a few battle scars, I like to call them, but that's okay. I think that it gives it character. It is a vintage van. There's not much I can do about that without actually replacing the exterior cladding, which is an option. I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm not a professional. I have got experience now from undertaking a job like this, but I'm not a professional painter or anyone who has heaps of experience working on projects like this. However, throughout the entire project, I did speak with other professionals to get advice for each step along the way. Something that I did notice is no matter who I spoke to, the next person would say something contradicting to the last person. Now, if you're painting an RV or Caravan, whatever you'd like to call it, it is definitely recommended to use an automotive paint. However, that painting process is much more complicated. There seems to be more steps involved. It's a much more toxic paint and definitely not ideal for doing outdoors. If you do want to have a really long-lasting, high-quality paint job, I would recommend going with an automotive paint, and you may have to pay a professional to apply that. Or alternatively, you could actually hire a spray booth yourself. So automotive paint was actually going to be extremely expensive for me. I had 2 quotes. One was about $1,500, which was the cheaper quote, and the other quote was actually I think close to $4,000. The cheaper one was actually at trade price because my friend owns a painting business and got a quote for me if I was to buy the paint through his business, which $1,500 was very reasonable. But then considering a lot of the other factors, like it's a really toxic paint, it takes a lot longer to curate on the van as well, so the drying time was much longer. I didn't have anywhere under cover to park the van. There was just a lot of like cons, I guess, for me to use automotive paint. And I looked on some Facebook forums and there was a lot of people actually recommending White Knight paint. So I contacted White Knight, the company, and they provided me a PDF document which actually explained exactly how to paint a Caravan with their paint. A couple of other paint manufacturers I did contact told me that none of their paints were actually suitable for a Caravan and that I'm best to use an automotive paint. But White Knight said that their paint was perfect to use on a Caravan. So I decided, not only was there a lot of reviews from other people around the country who have used this paint, but they also had a PDF document explaining how to paint a Caravan with their paint. So that felt really promising, and that's why I decided to go with White Knight paint. All right, so now we've got that out of the way, let's actually get into the step-by-step guide on how I would recommend to prepare and paint your Caravan if you're going to do this yourself. So I actually used a couple of different methods trying to remove the paint because it was such a labor-intense and mentally draining process trying to use an orbital sander. So I tried to sand it myself, just with an orbital sander. I had a couple of friends come and visit and try and help as well, but it was a very time-consuming process, and not to mention how like repetitive it was physically. I ended up getting tendonitis in my elbow just from sanding for so many hours trying to remove all the layers of paint. I was removing 2 layers that the previous owners had painted over the Caravan, plus the original. I think there was like 3 coats of paint, so there was like 5 in total that I was trying to sand back and remove from the Caravan, and that's why it was taking me so long. I had a lot of people recommend at the time to use paint stripper, but for some reason I just felt a little bit scared to use it and thought, oh no, I'll just keep chipping away with this sanding thing. So I did that for a while, ended up injuring my arm with tendonitis in my elbow. So I kind of gave up on the project for a while and explored different ways to remove paint. Now, one method I came across was vapor blasting. So I contacted a business, they came out and attempted to vapor blast the paint off the surface of the Caravan. However, that is definitely not recommended for 3mm thick exterior cladding. It actually is too powerful and dints the Caravan. So I've actually got quite a few dints from where the guy was vapor blasting on the Caravan that I couldn't see when it was just the silver aluminium. But now that I've painted the Caravan white in certain light, when we get shadowing, I can definitely see where the dints are from vapor blasting. So vapor blasting is very similar to sand blasting. I believe they just use 2 different types of products to actually perform the job. So yeah, sand blasting, vapor blasting, maybe for a much thicker, stronger metal to remove paint, but definitely not off exterior cladding. So don't do that. I felt really overwhelmed for quite a few months. I had a lot of things happening in my personal life. My mum was battling a terminal cancer diagnosis and she was in and out of hospital, so that kind of put this project on the back burner quite a few times. By December 2021, I got back into removing the paint, and this time round I used paint stripper and very quickly realised I'd made a mistake this entire time not using it in the first place. So if you're going to remove paint from a Caravan, I recommend using paint stripper. You need to have a lot of protective wear on. If you do get it on your skin, which is not a good thing, it does burn. So make sure you're close to a tap or something. I have a tap about 20 meters away, so anytime I'd accidentally flick some onto my skin, because it was so hot I couldn't cover my whole body, I would just run over to the tap and rinse my skin, and then it was fine. But yeah, it definitely burns quite badly if you get that on your skin. You definitely want to be wearing eye protection. You do not want to get that in your eyes. If you did, you'd probably lose an eye. So yeah, protection when using paint stripper is highly recommended. So paint stripping is a really messy process. The paint that is basically peeling off and that you're scraping off goes everywhere. So I would recommend putting down some plastic tarps all around the ground, around the Caravan. And also taping and covering all of the windows if you have windows in the caravan at the time. My windows in my caravan I get asked a lot of questions about, but the previous owners actually installed them, so I have no idea where they're from, but they're one of the reasons why I actually bought the caravan. I really like the black modern look to the windows. Unfortunately, I was paint stripping and didn't cover those windows to protect them, so there are a few spots where the paint strip actually got onto the window and has damaged it a little bit. So I've learned from my mistake, and I'm sharing with you guys, tape your windows and put some plastic down as well over the windows to protect them, and anything else on the caravan that you might not want to get destroyed. Maybe you have a nice new freshly painted drawbar, I would also cover that. Another tip is if you're working on your caravan roof, I've seen quite a few people across YouTube who just simply sit on top of their roof. I'm really lucky in my caravan, the framework is actually aluminium, so I feel like that would be a little stronger than wood, which most of these vans have wooden frames. Now, whether it's aluminium or wood, it doesn't matter. You shouldn't really be sitting on the roof of your caravan. You should, what I did is got 2 little planks of wood and put them either side at the strongest part of the roof, so where the roof meets the wall, and then I'd put a big beam of wood across that, so I'd be sitting on that big beam which is resting on the little planks of wood, and then most of the weight is going down at the strongest part of the roof rather than actually sitting on the roof. Another thing, be prepared for extra trips to the hardware store. There's always going to be something that you run into where you need a tool or something that you don't have and you've got to run along and buy extra gear. I recommend trying to borrow as much stuff as you can. So before you even start on the project, really think about what tools you might need and ask friends and family whether or not they've got things that they can lend you. Otherwise, you're going to be spending a lot of money on tools, just like I did at Bunnings or your local hardware store. Now, living this lifestyle, I'm very minimalistic, but I actually have a really large selection of tools that I have to store in the shed on this property here, which eventually I'm going to have to sort through and probably sell things that I know I will no longer need now that the project's over. But yeah, I recommend trying to borrow as much gear as possible. And one more tip is try and avoid using silicone. Now, you might already have silicone on your van and you can't really avoid it. If you can, try and remove it before you paint it, and then reseal the van with a sealant, because silicone actually, it can't be painted over. If you already have silicone, you can do 2 things. You can either remove the existing silicone and replace it with a sealant that's paintable, or you can try and use shellac, which is what I did on the roof because I'd already resealed that about 4 years ago, unfortunately with silicone, before I knew that wasn't paintable. And so to overcome that, I actually sprayed all of the silicone with shellac, which acts as kind of like a barrier. It adheres to the silicone and then allows the paint to adhere to the shellac, which means the silicone can be painted over. So I was okay with just using that process because it's up on the roof, but if you've got areas on the sides of the van which are going to be seen a lot of the time, I'd probably recommend removing the silicone and resealing those areas that are visible with like another sealant that is paintable, just in case for some reason the shellac doesn't work, and then down the track, say a few months, you find the paint actually peeling off those areas and all of your hard work might be jeopardized. So as I said, paint stripping was by far the best method to remove all the paint, so definitely use paint stripper. Obviously it's a little more pricey, and I did find like some parts of the van which had less layers of paint only required a little bit of the paint stripper, but then there was some areas that I had to sort of paint strip twice because there was so many layers of paint. So I wasn't really calculating how much paint stripper I bought, so I can't tell you how much, but I guess it probably says on the tin how many square meters one tin can do, but I would always overestimate because I find sometimes, even with the paint, when I bought the paint, it said a certain amount would do a certain amount and it didn't, and I ended up needing to go to Bunnings and buy more paint. So once you've completely paint stripped the entire van, you're going to go over the whole van again with 120 grit sandpaper on an orbital sander. If you still have chunks of paint, sometimes this happens, I noticed when I was doing my van, there was sections where like the paint strip kind of re-adhered to the surface, and so on those areas I had to use like a 60 to 80 grit sandpaper to really get that off, and then I'd go over that again with 120 grit sandpaper. So you do that to the entire van. So once you've finished sanding the whole Caravan, you're going to use a high pressure hose to get rid of any chemicals from the paint strip left over, and also get rid of a lot of the dust. This is the point where I'd probably recommend resealing the van, because I found I did it in sort of different steps. I'd paint strip this little bit, I'd sand this little bit, I'd reseal this bit, and because I didn't do it in like a really organized way, I was kind of doing a bit here, there and everywhere because I'd get bored doing one activity for so long. I found towards the end, I'd go back around the van and notice that I'd actually missed spots because I wasn't doing it in a really organized way, and also I was doing it over a really long period rather than in a short period. It's so hot and humid today that my camera just overheated. It stopped recording and said it's too hot, so that might happen again. Hopefully it doesn't. Anyway, as I was saying, if you guys can get help for doing a project like this, that would be most ideal. I've been watching Sailing La Vagabond, who are actually building a new boat at the moment. Well, at least they're having a company build a new boat for them. And something that I noticed in their episodes is the people building the boat actually have like 20 people working on it at the same time doing all different things. I know that this isn't a boat, but it makes sense to have, instead of just one person trying to do an entire project like this that involves lots of steps, if you've got a few people doing things at the same time, that would be much more ideal. For example, you could have somebody starting paint stripping and sort of working all the way around the van, and then another person's following them sanding, and that would make things so much quicker. So once you've actually sanded the Caravan, then you're going to move on to sealing the Caravan. I actually found the best method was using a wire brush on a drill, which helped actually get into all of the little tiny cracks and clean the metal really well of any old paint as well that the paint stripper missed. Once you've actually removed all the old silicone or sealant, whatever it might be, if you're unsure, probably best to remove it anyway to make sure it's not silicone and the paint is going to adhere to it. Then you're going to actually clean that whole area with a degreaser or thinners I used, and making sure that that area is really clean. So you can use white cloths when you're cleaning with a degreaser to make sure there's no old chemicals from the paint strip or no dust, because if you do have chemicals or dust there, it's going to potentially prevent the sealant from adhering to the surface and making it watertight. Then you're going to use a sealant that is paintable. Now when you're choosing one, make sure it's suitable for, I use marine ones, so ones that are suitable for like RVs, boats, being out in the sun a lot, and that are sort of flexible but also paintable. So once you've applied a really neat bead, line bead, whatever you want to call it, of the sealant into the section that you're working on, you're then going to spray it with dishwashing liquid and water. When you actually mold the silicone into that area with your finger, it's going to stop the sealant from adhering to other areas that you don't want it to stick to, and it's going to help you get a really clean, neat result. So once you've saturated that area with dishwashing liquid and water, you're also going to spray your hand. Now, using your finger is the most common method, but I have heard people use paddle pop sticks as well, and that's something that I did use inside in the bathroom, which gave me a really neat finish. But because my external cladding is kind of like rippled, it's not really just like a flat surface. A flat surface would be good, a paddle pop stick would be good for a flat surface, but your finger is a little bit better when you've really got to kind of mold and get in there. So you use your finger and you sort of go along, and then all of it will pile up on your hand, and you wipe it on a cloth. So you have a dedicated cloth for wiping the sealant, going along, wiping it on there. Then you have another cloth, not the one that you've wiped the sealant on, because it is messy stuff and it gets everywhere. And you're going to wipe all of the, I don't know, if there's any mess or anything, or the old dishwashing liquid that might still be all around that area, you can kind of like dry it off. And it's as simple as that. So grinding it out, cleaning the surface, applying the sealant, spraying dishwashing liquid, and then using your finger to mold it into the area you're trying to seal. So I actually removed the trim from around my windows before painting it so that I could sand and prepare the surface around the windows nice and neat. So when I was painting the van, I could get the paint in really close, and that, you know, it's not like you take the trim off and you'd see the old original paint. So I made sure I removed the trim and sanded really close into the windows as well. Definitely protect your windows when you're sanding near them. I didn't, and there's a few scratches from that process as well. But when I removed the trim, my windows actually were no longer sealed, because the original trim is what was sealing the windows from weather. I painted the Caravan and then sealed the windows after painting it, but because I have black windows, I used black sealant, and it was a really messy job. And a few times I actually got a little bit of that sealant on the Caravan and it stained. So I would definitely recommend, if you do have to seal windows, do that before painting, so that you can make sure it's a really neat and tidy finish and you're not risking ruining your fresh paint job. So yeah, definitely seal your windows before you paint the Caravan. So once I've sealed the windows and all of the trim, I then went around and replaced any missing rivets, because it is an old van, so some of the original rivets which attach the external cladding to the framework of the Caravan had popped out and were missing. And my friend, who's an engineer, actually told me that if you are using, say, rivets or screws in aluminium, the rivet or screw has to also be aluminium, because steel and aluminium apparently aren't compatible and can have some kind of chemical reaction. There was a really big dent on the rear of the Caravan, kind of at eye height, so I decided to use metal bog to actually patch that one up. I also removed a couple of screws that were on the outside of the Caravan that didn't hold any purpose anymore. I couldn't actually screw them out with a screwdriver or my drill. I actually had to use an angle grinder to cut those ones off. And I also removed a few other screws that were still in the Caravan from a really old awning that was probably on there, and they didn't hold any purpose anymore. So when I removed those, they left a hole in the Caravan. So I actually went and used metal bog and patched up those holes and sanded those back. I didn't really document that too much. I only filmed one bit where I was doing it on the back of the Caravan, because there was so much work that I had to do, and I didn't have enough time to like film everything. So yeah, that's actually what I used to plug a lot of the existing like screw holes where it was just like a hole left in the Caravan. So once you've replaced all of the sealant around the entire Caravan and it's watertight again, you're going to go over the entire Caravan with 1000 grit sandpaper by hand, just when you thought the sanding was finished. Now what this actually does is makes the surface of the Caravan extremely smooth and gets rid of any little, I don't know, I thought the Caravan was already smooth after sanding it with the 120 as I run my hand along it, but actually when I used the 1000 grit sandpaper, I couldn't believe how smooth it got it. And the real reason that you're doing this is because it's going to give the paint a better finish. Obviously, if you've got like a coarse texture and you paint over that, it's going to look coarse and feel coarse with the paint. The paint's not going to fill those holes. So by sanding with the 1000 grit sandpaper and getting that really smooth surface, which you're feeling with your hand by touch, making sure it's really smooth and there's no bumps, that is going to give you a really nice finish. So once you finish sanding for the second time, you're going to high pressure hose the entire Caravan, trying to get rid of as much dust and chemicals as possible. Once you've high pressure hosed the entire Caravan, you're going to get a degreaser with some white cloths and wipe over the entire Caravan again. You're going to be so sick of this by the end of it, just like I was. I couldn't believe how many steps were involved and how big of a job this was until I actually got up to the painting stage. Most of the work is in the preparation. It is so important to get the prep right, because the painting part is, I guess, reasonably easy. It does have its challenges. A lot of people said that's the easy part, but it still does have its challenges, especially if you haven't used a spray gun before or you haven't done a project like this before in general. So make sure you're really taking your time in the prep. Be patient, don't try and rush things. Maybe once you think you've finished, take a day or so to actually just like sit with yourself and really think about things that you might be forgetting. Walk around the van looking up and down everywhere multiple times to see if you've missed anything, because I actually noticed I had missed a few things, like sealing underneath the van, kind of at the front and the rear where it curves like this, I'd missed sealing those areas. So lucky I actually took my time and checked those spots. Now's a really good opportunity as well to take care of your drawbar, because it is something that's also visible, and you might want to remove existing paint, give it a really good brush down with a wire brush, and you know, when you're painting your Caravan, maybe you can paint your drawbar as well. For me, I actually did that. I took care of the drawbar and ended up painting it as well. But I've since had a Caravan engineer come and look at my Caravan, and I've had it weighed, and I actually need to get a new one. So that was kind of a little bit of waste of time taking care of my drawbar, but it's okay, because for the meantime, at least it still looks nice and fresh, especially to complement the rest of the van now that it's painted. So when you are degreasing the entire Caravan, you have to use white cloths, because that way you can really see that the Caravan surface is clean. So you don't want to have any dust left on the van before painting it. So you're going to be wiping the Caravan with the white cloth until it looks clean. Now, I actually found that it took a really long time. Even after high pressure hosing the entire Caravan, I actually found there was still a lot of like residue dust on the van, and I actually had to wipe it a fair bit to get clean cloths. So something that I didn't actually really consider until the time came was having an undercovered area for me to paint my Caravan. I was always under the assumption that I could just paint it out in the open, that it would be fine. After calling the paint manufacturer, they gave me a few extra details that weren't listed on the website or that weren't listed on the tin, which I'm so thankful that I called them. So if you guys are looking at painting and you're using a different paint to me, I recommend calling the paint manufacturer and asking for some technical advice, because there might be some extra information you guys should be aware of before painting your van. So the big thing for me was I was originally planning to paint my Caravan just out in the open, waiting for some good weather, low wind, no chance of rain. But because I live in a subtropical environment, at this time of year especially, there's pretty much no 24-hour period where there's a chance of no rain. There's always a chance of rain here. Even if it doesn't rain, it might rain, and if you're painting a Caravan, you can't take the risk of, oh, it might not rain. You need to actually have somewhere that you can put the Caravan under in case you do get some rain, because if the paint gets wet, all of your hard work could be ruined, and you might need to start the entire process again. So when I called the paint manufacturer, firstly he said to me the surface of the Caravan can't be hot to touch when you're painting it. You also don't really want to be doing it at a humid time of year. He also said that when I apply the primer, I have to apply the top coat within 2 to 12 hours, and if I actually exceeded that time, I had to repaint the entire Caravan with the primer again. He also said that once I apply the top coat, it cannot get wet for at least 24 hours. So at that point, when I found out that information, I realized that I just couldn't paint the Caravan out in the open. So I was brainstorming different ways that I could get it under a shelter, thinking, did I know anyone who had some kind of shelter that I could use? Could I hire something? But at the end of the day, the cheapest and best method for me was to just buy a tarp, a really big tarp, and string it up in the trees above the Caravan, which was going to protect the van from leaves that are going to blow down and also possible rain. I also made sure that the tarp that I bought was extremely large, so it wasn't the exact size of my Caravan, because obviously if you got rain and wind, it could blow under. There was still a risk of that, but I made sure that I actually chose to paint it on a day where there was an extremely low chance of rain, so if we did get rain, it was probably going to be a really small amount. So before painting the van as well, I recommend practicing, not just on a piece of cardboard like what I did, but on a piece of material that is pretty much the same as whatever you're painting. So for me, I should have used a piece of aluminium, because obviously as I practice the spray painting method, it's going to adhere to that surface quite differently to cardboard, which I'm assuming actually absorbs a lot of the paint. I was spraying onto cardboard and it was looking good, but then when I sprayed on the Caravan, it was also looking good, but then by the time I got around the other side and had a look, I noticed that there was actually runs. Now, to get rid of runs, you pretty much have to sand it back again and then reapply and then paint. So I kind of just thought, I'm just going to paint it. I don't care about these runs, which sucks. But because the van is being painted white, they're not that noticeable. I can notice them because I'm a perfectionist, and I'm sure a professional looking at them would notice them, but I think the average person's not really going to notice them unless you point them out. The fact that the van's white, it's very bright and glary, so that kind of hides those imperfections a little bit. There was also another spot when I applied the primer, I noticed the paint stripper hadn't been removed properly. I don't know how that happened because I felt like I was really thorough with the high pressure hose, the sanding and the degreasing, but there was a little bit near the front door that actually bubbled up as if paint stripper was there. I'm not sure if it was actually paint stripper left there or there was some weird chemical reaction with the primer, but something happened there. So what I did was I painted the primer over the whole van. I started on the roof first, and I did one side of the roof, then I did the other side of the roof, then I did, say, this side, and I eased my way back to the ladder, and then I was able to get, I actually had a ladder on the roof as well to hold the tarp up, so I just kind of didn't do, like I ended up being able to push it up on an angle, so it was only on 2 feet, and it was so tightly wedged with the tarp that it was able to just go up on 2 feet, and I just didn't paint under those 2 feet spots, and then once it dried I touched those bits up. But I kind of backed down onto the ladder and then sprayed that little bit, got off, took the ladder away, and then did around the sides. And I did that same method for the top coat as well. So my tips are, before spray painting, practice a fair bit on a surface that is very much like what you're actually going to paint. In hindsight, I probably could have done 2 things. My technique could have been a little bit different to avoid overspraying, which is what caused the runs, or maybe I diluted the primer a little bit too much. Either way, I think it was more so user error, and that I was probably moving a little bit too slowly and too close, and I kind of could have come back away from the surface a bit more and been more quick about it, and that way I wouldn't have had the overspray. So taping all of the windows was a process that I thought was going to take an hour, but ended up taking me nearly 4 hours. It's a very tedious job, and you have to be very thorough, because obviously for me, having nice black windows, I couldn't risk having any white paint spray on them. So I had to be really thorough about the way that I was taping everything. The wheels, the drawbar, which I taped but then realised I didn't need to because I was spraying it with the primer. The stabilisers at the back of the van, the power inlet and the water inlet, all these little things, the front door as well, like absolutely everything you have to tape. And yeah, it took about 4 hours, and I had planned to get up early that morning and paint the van early, but because the taping took so long, and then me filming it as well, me getting the paint out, getting the paint organised, practicing, I didn't actually start priming the van until about lunchtime. By the time I'd painted it, waited it for it to dry, and then done the first top coat of the white, it was nearly night time, and I actually couldn't do the second coat within the next 2 hours. So the next morning I came back extremely early and then did the final coat. So that's pretty much how I would recommend painting a Caravan start to finish as a DIYer. I'm sure that if any professionals out there watch this, you'll probably hear something I say. Maybe I've given the wrong advice, but please comment below so that people watching this can also read the comments and understand certain parts of the process a little bit better. This is definitely one of the hardest things that I've ever done in my life. Because it was such a big project, I did it pretty much all by myself. I had a little bit of help from a few friends that would visit occasionally, but I would say that 98% of the work was done myself. And I am really proud of myself. The first person that I wanted to call when I actually finished painting it was my mum, but for you guys who might be new here, my mum passed away last October, and she was battling terminal cancer for 3 years, and I think, you know, her being in and out of hospital and so unwell for so long was part of the reason why this whole project kind of went on the back burner a few times, because obviously I had to be there for my mum. And, you know, all last year she'd be like, you know, when are you going to paint the Caravan? And I think since her passing, that's what motivated me to really get this done. Is, you know, Mum wouldn't want me to be held back by grief. She'd want me to be strong and carry on in life and get this done. Oh, that makes me sad. So I used all of my love that I still have for her, of course, that I can no longer give to her, I poured into this project, and I'm going to continue pouring into obviously all different aspects of my life for the rest of my life. But I thought, no, Mum always wanted me to get my Caravan painted, so I thought, let's do it. I do feel like there's nothing that I can't do now when it comes to renovating a caravan. Thank you so much for watching this episode. I hope that it was insightful and helpful to anyone who might be tackling a project like what I just did. I'm pretty happy with the outcome. It's not 100% perfect, but it's my home, and somehow things feel more valuable when you've built them with your own hands. So I recommend giving it a go yourself. I actually saved thousands of dollars by doing this project myself. Before even beginning, I reached out to a few different companies to get quotes on how much it would cost for me to have my caravan painted, and they were quoting around like $12,000, which is a lot of money. In hindsight, it's definitely worth $12,000, firstly because they'd be using automotive paint and it is such a massive job. I totally understand why they charge that much money, but that's just not the sort of money that I could part with at the time for something like this. Instead, I'm actually going to invest that money into repairing and upgrading my chassis, because I feel like that's the most important part of this entire home, especially if I decide to travel on the road. I want to be extremely safe, not only for myself but for other people, and also I don't want to travel on the road and destroy my home by not making sure that the chassis is actually strong enough to carry the weight of my caravan. In my next episode, you'll hear more about how I had my caravan weighed, and also how I had an engineer visit the caravan to test the metal to see if the chassis is in good enough health to carry the weight of my caravan. You can actually see some behind the scenes footage in my short reels that I've now started posting on YouTube. I post a lot on TikTok and Instagram reels as well, so you can jump on those platforms and follow me. But if you'd rather stay on YouTube, you can watch my longer format videos just like this, but I also have really short format videos now too that I'm posting on a more regular basis under YouTube Shorts. Anyway, I will see you guys in my next episode.